Everyone keeps waiting for the crash, the big, dramatic one. The 2008 sequel, where markets drop 40% in a month, and everyone gets to post about how they saw it coming. But the biggest threat to the US economy right now isn't companies dying. It's the companies that refuse to. Because scattered across the economy, hiding inside stock indexes, private equity portfolios, and probably your retirement account, there's an entire class of company that is technically alive and functionally dead. They generate revenue. They pay salaries. They put out press releases with the word transformation in them. But they don't earn enough money to cover the interest on their own debt. Not the debt itself, just the interest. Economists have a name for these companies. They call them zombies. And depending on whose definition you use, there's somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 listed companies in America. So the real question isn't whether the zombies exist, it's how they're still walking around. Because the answer to that question is quietly one of the most important stories in the entire economy. Let's start with the definition, because zombie company gets thrown around a lot, and most people use it wrong. The formal version comes from the Bank for International Settlements, which is basically the central bank for central banks. A zombie is a mature company, so not a startup burning cash on purpose, that has failed to earn enough operating profit to cover its interest payments for at least 3 years in a row. Read that again. 3 straight years where the core business couldn't even pay the interest bill, let alone touch the principal. Which means the debt is never getting paid down. The debt isn't a bridge to somewhere. The debt is the business model. And to understand how a company like that stays alive, you have to go back to where the term was born. Japan, the 1990s. Because in 1992, Japan's asset bubble burst, and Japanese banks were suddenly sitting on mountains of loans to companies that were, by any honest measure, finished. But here's the thing. If a bank admits the loan is dead, the bank has to take the loss. And Japanese banks were so fragile that taking those losses might have taken the banks down with them. So they did something else. They just kept lending. A loan would come due, the company obviously couldn't pay, and the bank would roll it into a brand new loan, sometimes at a rate below what the bank itself paid for money. Economists call this evergreening, which is a lovely word for pretending. The company survives, the bank avoids the loss, and everyone gets to keep saying the word performing with a straight face. The result was an economy full of dead companies occupying buildings, employing workers, and undercutting healthy competitors, while producing basically nothing in the way of growth. Japan didn't get a crash. Japan got 3 decades of flatline. The lost decades weren't caused by companies dying. They were caused by companies not dying. Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because after 2008, the rest of the world ran the same experiment, just with better branding. Central banks cut rates to 0 and left them there for the better part of a decade. And when money costs nothing, a strange thing happens. Nobody has to be profitable. A company with weak earnings and heavy debt doesn't die, it refinances. The debt comes due, you borrow new money to pay off the old money, and because rates kept falling, the new loan was usually cheaper than the old one. Your business could shrink every single year, and your interest bill would shrink faster. It was a treadmill that ran downhill. And the data shows exactly what you'd expect. In the late 1980s, roughly 2% of listed companies in advanced economies were zombies. By the late 2000s and 10s, the BIS put it around 12%. That's not a cycle. That's a 6-fold structural increase in companies that only exist because refinancing exists. Then came the plot twist. In 2020 and 2021, money got even cheaper, and companies issued record amounts of debt at the lowest rates in recorded history. And then, in 2022, the Fed delivered the fastest rate hikes in 4 decades. The overnight rate went from basically 0 to over 5% in 18 months. And remember, zombies don't die when business gets bad. Business was always bad. Zombies die when refinancing gets expensive. Because all that cheap debt from 2020 has a maturity date. Wall Street calls it the maturity wall. Hundreds of billions of dollars of corporate debt that has to be refinanced over the next few years at rates 2, 3, sometimes 4 times higher than where it was issued. The downhill treadmill flipped to uphill. And for a company that couldn't cover its interest at 4%, rolling into 9% isn't a haircut. It's a death sentence. So this is the part where the mass extinction happens, right? Rates spiked, the treadmill reversed, the zombies drop. Except, mostly they didn't. Bankruptcies rose, sure, 2024 saw more large corporate bankruptcy filings than any year since 2010. But nothing like the cull the math would suggest. And the reason is that the financial system has spent the last few years inventing increasingly creative ways to not say the word default. The first trick is called amend and extend, which practitioners lovingly call amend and pretend. The borrower can't refinance at today's rates, so the lender just moves the maturity date, pushes the problem 2 years down the road, collects a fee, marks the loan healthy. The second trick is the distressed exchange, which is a default wearing a trench coat. The company goes to its bondholders and says, "We can't pay you, but here's a new bond, worth less, due later. Take it or find out what you get in bankruptcy court." And bondholders usually take it. More than half of U.S. corporate defaults in recent years have been these exchanges rather than actual bankruptcies. The company defaults and keeps right on walking. And the third trick, if you saw my video on private credit, you already know. Payment in kind. Can't pay the interest in cash? Just add it to the principal. No missed payment, no default, no problem. The loan gets bigger, the company gets deader, the paperwork gets cleaner. And in this cycle, there's even a fourth trick, one Japan never had access to. Retail investors. Because when AMC was staring into the abyss in 2021, it didn't get saved by a bank. It got saved by its own fans, who bought billions of dollars of newly printed shares because a stock ticker had become a personality. AMC sold its survival directly to the public. Meme money became the lender of last resort. And look, sometimes a near zombie genuinely claws its way back. Carvana got written off in 2023, restructured its debt, and came roaring back. It happens. But for every comeback story, there's a WeWork. A company once valued at $47 billion, kept upright for years by SoftBank shoveling in more than $10 billion, burning cash through the cheapest money era in history. And the moment the refinancing environment turned, it collapsed into bankruptcy anyway. The life support didn't save it, it just made the funeral more expensive. Now, here's the part where you might be thinking, okay, but why do I care? If some over-leveraged sponge factory in Ohio wants to shamble along forever, how is that my problem? And this is the actual point of the video. Because zombie companies aren't just a sad story about bad balance sheets, they're contagious. Not to other companies' finances, but to the economy itself. Economists call it congestion. Zombies sit on things healthy companies need. They occupy real estate. They hold on to workers who would create more value somewhere else. They keep factories and market share and shelf space locked up. And because they're fighting for survival, they do desperate things. They cut prices to levels that don't make sense because any revenue is better than none. Which means the healthy company across the street, the one that actually earns its interest payments, now has to compete with a rival that's effectively subsidized by its own creditors' denial. Research on Japan found exactly this. In industries crowded with zombies, healthy firms invested less, hired less, and grew slower. The dead didn't just refuse to die, they pulled the living down with them. That's the real cost. It doesn't show up as a crash, it shows up as an economy where productivity mysteriously stagnates, wages mysteriously stall, and nobody can quite point at the villain, because the villain is technically still in business. And if you're waiting for the Fed to fix this, here's the uncomfortable math. The Fed has been cutting rates, and zombies are still defaulting at the fastest pace in over a decade. Because the Fed controls the overnight rate, but a company refinancing today is still rolling debt issued at 2021 prices into a world where nothing is priced like 2021 anymore. Cuts make the treadmill less steep. They don't make it downhill again. And honestly, the darker possibility is the one nobody wants. That the cuts work just well enough to keep the zombies upright. Because there are really only two endings to this story. Ending 1, the maturity wall hits, the pretending stops, and the weakest companies finally fail. Which sounds bad, but it's how the system is supposed to work. Capital gets released, workers move to businesses with a future, and the economy clears. Painful, fast, over. Ending 2, we keep amending, extending, and paying in kind. Nobody takes the loss, nothing clears, and we drift into the Japanese version. No crash, no headlines, just an economy that slowly stops moving. So everyone's watching for the dramatic chart, the red candle, the crash they can screenshot. But the scariest chart in economics has no crash in it at all. It's the one that goes flat, and stays flat for 30 years.